All right, here we are, ready for the project day 261 as we make our way through H.G. Wells's text, The Outline of History. This is part of our integrated curricula here at Apocatastasis. So we call this the project, unifying our enrolled students as well as our alumni and distance learners and those who participate in our seminars. Slowly but surely, the project is coming together very nicely. So, won't you join us on this adventure? And indeed, we're making our way through the outline of history. I'll go fetch that text very shortly. We're looking at the question today, Civil War or Revolution, in the context of the American Revolution. And H.G. Wells brings up this very question, as does any real serious student of the conflict in the 1770s, 1780s here in North America. But before we even have the chance to ask that question, we have to look at the French and Indian War. Before altogether we get too long in the tooth, let's get a poem in and an advertisement, and then we'll go off to the races. Let's flip those around, actually. Let's get our ad in first, and that is indeed, what do we have queued up here? I'm sure it's good. Yes, Apocatastasis Press. So I mentioned distance learners earlier. And part of that work of Apocatastasis, our little school here in Connecticut, is to enrich people's reading lives. And so you can see on our press page, we have some unique titles here. In fact, we can see them queued up. There's more coming, actually. I'm preparing a few more in the months ahead. But for the moment, we have A Path to the Hidden Rus, A Meeting Russia's Old Believers by Vladimir Basinkoff, whom you're going to be seeing a bit more of at the college. We have our course catalog that's actually free to download. The Great Conversation, a republishing of that essay from the 50s. Pearls Before Swine, Nudism, Education, and the High Trust Society by yours truly. Also by yours truly, the Denaldiad, the Trotsky Train, Hurt, some thoughts on disillusion, distrust, and disorientation these last few years, kind of an emotional history. Not that the history is emotional, but it's literally looking at the really the angle of trauma in Western societies since the 19th century. That's Hurt. We have our pilgrimage manual that's coming up soon. The Murder Machine by Patrick Pierce, an excellent essay, newly typeset with an introduction by myself. Holy Compline, where you have Compline from the Liturgia Orarum with special chant notation, which is not available anywhere else so far as I can tell. Anyway, all of those titles and more are available for you at Apocatastasis Press. This is a great way to assist your institute. All right. So with that being seen too, now it's time for our poem. We're looking indeed at the American Revolution, though we have to muck around in the French and Indian War, which sets the stage for things. And in this time period, so we'll see between the two times, the two wars in the 1760s, you have the composition of Chester. And for some reason at that time, people would name songs after very innocuous things. So this is actually a revolutionary song. Chester precedes it. The original version precedes it from the 1760s. Then it's retooled in the fashion that will be obviously appropriate to the American side of the Revolution. But yeah, if you are at all familiar with music and reels and ballads and things from the 18th century, you'll often find they have completely unrelated names to things. And one example would be Chester. So let me bring the lyrics up on deck here. And this broadcast and this recording is indeed. Um, there we go. There's Chester. Part of our project. We're making our way through H.G. Wells's Outline of History, but that's not it. We also have a poetry that accompanies this, and we have such an example coming on the screen momentarily. So we see that William Billings' Chester become a well-known song of the American Revolution. The most popular version, multiple versions, the most popular for his second was his second version of the song published in 1778. And William Billings wrote this text himself. We're going to make it much bigger for the sake of our little eyeballs late at night here. There we go. And you can sing it. Obviously well tuned for good congregational Protestant singing in the 18th century. So I suppose I can sing the first stanza and then I'll recite the rest as poetry. But you want to imagine you're singing this in a beer hall or in a church or something. Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clank her galling chains. We fear not them, we trust in God, New England's God forever reigns. And that's the tune that it goes by. So very good for singing in a group. Howe and Burgoyne and Clinton too, the British generals, with Prescott and Cornwallis joined, together plot our overthrow in one infernal league combined. When God inspired us for the fight, their ranks broke, their lines were forced, their ships were shattered in our sight, or swiftly driven from our coast. The foe comes on with haughty stride, our troops advance with martial noise. Their veterans flee before our youth, and generals yield to beardless boys. What grateful offering shall we bring? What shall we render to the Lord? Loud alleluias let us sing, and praise his name on every chord. Tu autem Domine miserere nobis, Deo gratias. Thus is Chester by William Billings. And I can tell you that I have written 2 additional stanzas to this song. And some fine day I will sing them for you. They appear in one of my books. Guess which one? So anyway, there's Chester, there's our poetry, and poetry is very much part of the project. It's very much part of this reading. So we have a 1-month cycle of poetry. If you choose to join, and you can access this from our subsite, a 1-month cycle of poetry. Right now, you can only access the 1-week cycle. We have to add to it, but the ultimate one will be 1 month, which I think is 260 odd poems. So it really can't be more familiar. You can't be familiar with more than that number of poetry realistically. So that's read on a monthly basis. And then right now we have a yearly cycle of readings, largely centered around the outline of history. And that will be expanded in time to a 3-year cycle, including the story of civilization, as well as tertiary readings from appropriate literature, particularly novels and so forth. So that in these cycles, we at the school not only are all on the same page, but also the genius of this is familiarity. Repetition is the mother of learning. And that's one of the biggest poverties in contemporary instruction is that people take a class and they never go back to it. They read a book one time and they never go back to it. You're never going to be educated if that's your attitude. And remember, education is not learning lots of knowledge. That is not education. Education involves cultivating a spirit as regards one's own disposition towards knowledge. And part of that is always knowing that repetition. I'm not going to just read this book once. I always have it in the back of my mind. I'm going to read this again and again. Repetition. So that's the genius of the project. And let me now go and fetch the book that we're going to start off with and switch the camera while we're at it. So we looked yesterday at the Industrial Revolution. And that is important to keep in mind that while we're looking at the American situation today and tomorrow, and then the French Revolution closing up the week, that you have these other things that are happening, I won't say completely unrelated, but independent of these political developments. We looked a lot yesterday at Ned Ludd. And where did I put the book? I think it's in my bag over here. And that reminds me, I am playing around a bit more with the different settings here. So I'm just going to play around with this for today, and let me know how you like the use of music in the background. So I'm going to download other pieces. Right now, they give me some generic pieces that are not altogether appropriate for our study here. But I've downloaded, as you saw briefly at the beginning of this broadcast, Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven, always a beautiful piece. And we will not play that right now. I put you to sleep. But we'll play the Oriental piece, Gandhara no Uta, from the film Ikaru. Actually, it's an older piece, but it's very prominent in the film Ikaru. So let me know how you like this in the background going forward. I'll try to have different music, maybe make it appropriate to the theme of the day. It should be, the world turned upside down or Yankee Doodle. But for today, we'll the American Revolution meets Shogunate Japan. Here we go. So here we have the outline of history for today. And if you go on our project site, you can actually see where we have the different pages laid out. We want to start here looking at the American Revolution. In fact, with the French and Indian War, because that sets the stage for things, especially the economics, which caused such consternation and such headaches for Parliament back in England, and such a rallying cry for the American revolutionaries. Again, I'm wrestling here with the... Oh, nope. See, it switched there. That's the danger of the music. All right. So we start here. Wells says, but if the inhabitants of the 13 colonies, looking at the French and Indian War, were miscellaneous in their origins and various in their habits and sympathies, they had three very strong antagonisms in common. They had a common interest against the Red Indians. For a time, they shared a common dread of French conquest and dominion. And thirdly, they were all in conflict with the claims of the British crown. So he begins this meditation earlier with a look at the diversity of the 13 colonies, religiously, economically, uh, personality wise, shall we say. I mean, they all hail from different parts of England and indeed different parts of Europe, depending on the origin of the colonies that ultimately find their way in British possession by the 1750s and 60s. So far as the danger went, the Indians were a constant evil, but never more than a threat of disaster. They remained divided against themselves, yet they had shown possibilities of combination upon a larger scale. The Five Nations of the Iroquois were a very important league of tribes, but it never succeeded in playing off the French against the English to secure itself. And no Red Indian Genghis Khan ever arose among these nomads of the New World. The French aggression was a more serious threat. The French never made settlements in America on a scale to compete with the English. But their government set about the encirclement of the colonies and their subjugation in a terrifying, systematic manner. The English in America were colonists. The French were explorers, adventurers, agents, missionaries, merchants, and soldiers. Only in Canada did they strike root. French statesmen sat over maps and dreamt dreams, and their dreams are to be seen in our maps and in the chain of forts, creeping southward from the Great Lakes and northward up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. The struggle of France and Britain was a worldwide struggle. It was decided in India, in Germany, and on the high seas. This is why you hear the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War often referred to as the real First World War. And there are certain preceding wars that can also claim that title, going back to the ancient world. Anyhow, in the Peace of Paris, the French gave England Canada and relinquished Louisiana to the inert hands of declining Spain. So Spain's sun is very much sinking by the late 18th century. It will linger for another century to the Spanish-American War. The Spanish will, much as the Ottomans will linger till a little bit after that, World War I time. But whether it's the Ottomans or the Spanish, eventually the English, they all get overextended. Empires always overextend themselves, and that's certainly the case in Spain. It was the complete abandonment of America by France, the conclusion of the French and Indian War. The lifting of the French danger left the colonists unencumbered to face their third common antagonist, the crown and government of their motherland. So you see these three antagonisms. Once again, the Indians, the French, and the British crown. The Indians are not a real threat by this point. The French have been set to heel over the Alleghenies and booted out of Canada after the French and Indian War, which we'll do a little bit more work on in a second. And then you have the final foe, so to speak, for the North American colonies, and that's the crown. And that, of course, begins the drama which leads up to the American Revolution. But we don't want to speedboat over the war itself. So I want to go back to that because it really does set a lot of things in motion. So let's dive a little bit deeper in this conflict and the war that made our world. This is from the New York Times. If it all right. So we see an illustration. This is going to drive me nuts. I have to go to print friendly. Anyway, we see British regulars, or perhaps French, we'll see. British forces outside Fort Duquesne in 1775. That's what we're looking at. in this woodcut. Right, so this is the age of the newspaper. So the woodcut is an easy way to get illustrations in papers. All right, this is nice. This is not nice. Okay. Oh my goodness. If I can't get this to go away, we will relocate to print friendly. Okay. So this is by Ross Douthat. Interesting name. 266 years ago this month, a column. Why is this not showing? There you go. You didn't even see all the background baseball. A column of British regulars commanded by General Edward Braddock was cut to pieces by French soldiers and their Native American allies in the woods just outside of today's Pittsburgh. The defeat turned into a rout when Braddock was shot off his horse, leaving the retreat to be managed by a young colonel officer named George Washington, whose own previous foray into the region had lit the tinder for the war. Very famous event where Washington takes over upon Braddock's death. He buries him famously in the road and has his troops march over the body of Braddock so that the Indians could not find it and dig it up. This was the beginning of the French and Indian War, known much less poetically as the 7 Years' War, which I thought as a boy was the most interesting war in all of history. I had encountered it originally through a public television version of The Last of the Mohicans, but I soon found that the real conflict exceeded even James Fenimore Cooper's romantic imagination. The complexity of forest warfare, the diversity of combatants on both sides, a colonial European and native, the majesty of the geographic setting, and especially the lakes and mountains and defiles of upstate New York. The ridiculous melodrama culminating in the Battle of Quebec, with a wee hour's cliff scaling that led to a decisive showdown in which both commanders were mortally wounded, James Wolfe in victory and Louis Joseph Montcalm in defeat. In school, the French and Indian War, faded into the background of my history classes. In world history, it was folded into the larger categories of colonial warfare and endless Anglo-French conflict. In American history, it was treated most as a prelude to the real business of the American Revolution, which I suppose we're guilty of here. Not only Washington, but also Ben Franklin and a long list of future Revolutionary era officers, from Daniel Morgan to Charles Lee, played roles in Braddock's doomed campaign. But returning to the 1750s as an adult reader of history and as a columnist trying to offer constructive thoughts about the history of wars in K through 12 education, I think my childhood self was basically correct. The war that evicted the French from North America was not only incredibly fascinating, but also one of history's most important wars. Indeed, from a certain perspective, the French and Indian War was more important than the American War of Independence. The revolution merely determined in what form Anglo-America would spread to embrace continental empire and global power, while the French and Indian War determined whether that continent spanning America would come into being at all. As a kid, I, a good patriotic American and stalwart New Englander, naturally rooted for the British and the American colonists. From their early string of setbacks at the hands of Montcalm and other canny French commanders, through their eventual triumphant invasion of New France. It was particularly easy to identify with the neurasthenic wolf. What the hell does this word mean? The victor of Quebec. See what this neurasthenic means. Someone suffering from neurasthenia. Thank you so much. Characterized by physical and mental fatigue, often accompanied by symptoms like irritability, anxiety, weakness, considered similar to chronic fatigue syndrome. Hmm. While neurasthenia is no longer a formally recognized diagnosis in the DSM, it's often considered a cultural variant of CFS. How interesting. Anything else here? What is neurasthenia called today? Okay. All right. So very. Oh, what's a neurasthenic personality? Is wired by the impermanence and prolific possibilities of modernity. Behavior is characterized by ceaseless anxiety and nervousness, which prevents them from fully committing to transcendent goals. All right, very interesting. So anyway, Wolf was like that. For an adult, we continue reading. Though the best book, like Fred Anderson's Crucible of War, is the best of the 21st century history of the conflict, or Alan Taylor's American Colonies for the bigger picture of North American empire. It's easy enough to end up rooting for the French. First, because they were obvious underdogs. New France had less than 15th as a what do you say, a fraction, a 1/15 of the population of the 13 colonies. It was constantly being cut off from its motherland by the British Navy. And it's something of a miracle that France lasted for as long and won as many victories as it did. But also because the French Empire in North America represented an unusual model of European colonization. The combination of smaller, scattered population, the harsher climate, and the distinctive vision of figures like Samuel de Champlain and the French Jesuits all contributed to a friendlier relationship with the Native American populations than obtained in the English colonies. That's a great use of the old word, obtained. So a world where the French somehow held on to their territories might have been more Catholic, whilst offering more possibilities. He says obviously a good thing, while offering more possibilities for indigenous influence, power, and survival in the world where England simply won the continent. That's interesting. I mean, that really would completely change the nature of the North American population had the Catholic French won and not the Puritan, Puritan-led 13 British colonies. Had that not become the dominant American culture, Protestant New England had perhaps the Quebec culture become the dominant culture, not just in Canada or in the province of Quebec, but indeed in what we call America now. You can see now, you can first of all see why people like playing what ifs with history. What if the British lost the French and Indian War? Would everything west of the Alleghenies be French and Catholic in culture, if not in religion? And that, I guarantee you, would have a completely different psychology amongst the people. All right. So we don't need to belabor the point here. I did want to just look at some of the legacy of the French and Indian War leading up to the American Revolution. And I had another article queued up here. The big one, of course, is going to be the debt. The British are able to keep the French beyond the Alleghenies, and then during the Napoleonic Wars, the French will, see themselves at the door. So the outstanding debt of the colonies owed to the mother country, but also the fighting skills, the veteran status that many American colonists, especially in the North, obtain as fighters, learning how to fight this guerrilla war in the forests of New York and Pennsylvania. This will stand the nascent Continental Army, so called, in very good stead. All right. So we just have some meditations here. And the final piece is this. Violence erupted in 1763 when Indians throughout the Great Lakes attacked Western British posts and settlements. The conflict, named Pontiac's War after the Ottawa chief who led the siege of Detroit, caused the British to issue the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited land sales and settlement west of the Appalachians, and kept soldiers stationed on the frontier to restore peace between the Indians and the colonists. I'll get to why that's important as regards the American Revolution soon enough. That policy compounded the frustrations of colonists such as George Washington, who believed the crown was denying them access to the lands they had helped conquer and had been promised as a bounty for their war service. Britain had won the French and Indian War and driven the French out of North America, but as a result, its empire suffered internal tensions that were to lead to revolution. Here we go. Great Britain also amassed a massive war debt during the conflict and expected the colonies to begin paying more taxes as a share of their defense. So you have the frustration of not being allowed to move over the Appalachians. So you have, let's take a look at the map here. Right. More or less, you can see the 13 colonies here in this kind of gray, and then the French. Actually, this is the frontier. This kind of white area is the frontier, and then the French are this kind of pink area here. The point is, after the French and Indian War, the French are beyond the Alleghenies. There's just a skeleton, a garrison, a force of soldiers with hunters and missionaries. And then you have the British colonies where people are hungry for land. They're not explorers and swashbuckling French. The voyageurs, guys here to make money and go back to France. The British here are here to stay, and there's lots of them. And so there's a big population pressure to move west. But the British Crown is preventing that because of Pontiac's War, and of course because of agreements with the French as well. That causes anxiety. Also, the British Crown allowed the Catholics in Quebec to practice their faith after the French and Indian War. Obviously, Quebec becomes a British possession. That freedom of religion is not taken to very kindly by the Puritans in New England. After all, they had left England to get away from Catholic things. And now all of a sudden there's a Catholic power, Quebec, Catholic province, breathing down their necks, or so they perceive it. So that's a problem. By the way, if you're interested, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, in his generation's attempt to make an American literature, of course, wrote Evangeline, the epic poem Evangeline, about the relocation of Quebec families down into New Orleans. So when Quebec was falling to the British, a bunch of these guys wanted to stay French, and so they resettled in Louisiana, which, if it wasn't British, was at least Spanish and Catholic. So you can look that up. Evangeline, a beautiful love story. And there's actually some French language songs which celebrate the love story. So there we go. So you have frustration, again, with westward migration being prohibited. You have anxiety with the Quebecois being allowed to practice Catholicism. And then you have the British Crown, what do you say, sending collection agents to pay back the French and Indian War debt. And this all leads to the anxieties and to the run-up to the American Revolution. And right now, having seen, at least briefly in this project, to the French and Indian War, we're gonna change the camera once more and get into those series of, taxes and, so-called violations that the colonists, or at least the rabble-rousers amongst the colonists, would see it, the different acts and demands for, repayment, none of which in my estimation seem all that outrageous. Um, take a look here. There we go. So there is a mention here, and we should put the American Revolution in the context of the English Revolution 100 years before. We really do want to spend a moment on that. So we'll just pick up here. And finally, attempts at taxation through the British Parliament as the supreme taxing authority of the empire. Under the pressures of this triple system of annoyances, the American colonists were forced to do a very considerable amount of hard political thinking. Such men as Patrick Henry and James Otis began to discuss the fundamental ideas of government and political association, very much as they had discussed in England in the days of Cromwell's Commonwealth. So, Cromwell is old news to you or I, and we don't even really know about the English Civil War here. But this was very much on the minds of 18th century Americans. These Americans began to deny both the divine origin of kingship and the supremacy of the British Parliament. To say such things as God made all men naturally equal. Ideas of earthly superiority are educational, not innate. Kings were made for the good of the people and not the people for them. These are slogans of the time. They're very Republican. No government has a right to make slaves of its subjects. Though most governments are de facto arbitrary and consequently the curse and scandal of human nature, yet none are de jure arbitrary, and so forth. Tu autem Domine miserere nobis. This ferment, last point on the English Civil War, leading to the American Civil War, or rather the American Revolution a century later. This ferment in political ideas of the Americans was started by English leaven, one very influential writer, John Locke, whose two treatises on civil government may be taken as much as one single book can be taken in such cases as the point of departure for modern democratic ideas. He was the son, pay attention, of a Cromwellian soldier. Locke was educated at Christ Church, Oxford, during the Republican ascendancy, and he spent some years in Holland as an exile. And his writings form a bridge between the bold political thinking of those earlier Republican days and the revolutionary movement, both in America and France. So that's the biggest, that's the overarching kind of philosophical movement that's going on, very much part of the Enlightenment. You have Locke and the consequences of the English Civil War. And then again, you have the immediacy of the results of the French and Indian War. The war that broke out was therefore in reality not a war between Britain and the colonists. It was a war between the British government and the colonists, with a body of Whig noblemen and a considerable amount of public feeling in England on the side of the latter. An early move after 1763 was an attempt to raise revenue for Britain and the colonies by requiring that newspapers and documents of various sorts should be stamped. This was stiffly resisted. The British Crown was intimidated, and the Stamp Act was repealed. And you'll notice that again and again, the British actually are hardly tyrants. Without becoming cheerleaders for one side or the other, the British were extremely accommodating to rather petulant uh, colonial demands. I mean, it isn't that outrageous to expect the colonists to have paid for their own defense. Their repeal of the Stamp Act was greeted by riotous rejoicing in London, more hearty even than those in the colonies. But the Stamp Act affair was only one eddy in a turbulent stream flowing towards civil war. Upon a score of pretexts up and down the coast, the representatives of the British government were busy asserting their authority on making the British government intolerable. The quartering of soldiers upon the colonists was a great nuisance. Rhode Island was particularly active in defying trade restrictions. Rhode Islanders were free traders, that is to say, smugglers. Surprised to see a mention of this. A government schooner, the Gaspé, ran aground off of Providence. She was surprised, boarded, and captured by armed men in boats and burnt. In 1773, with the total disregard of the existing colonial sea trade, special advantages for the importation of tea into America were given by the British Parliament to the East India Company. It was resolved by the colonists to refuse and boycott this tea. This is your tea party, right? When the tea importers at Boston showed themselves resolute to land their cargoes, a band of men disguised as Indians, in the presence of a great crowd of people, boarded the 3 ships and threw the tea overboard. All 1774 was occupied in the gathering up of resources on either side for the coming conflict. It was decided by the British Parliament in the spring of 74 to punish Boston, which was seen as the head of the rebellion, by closing report. Now, there is no formal rebellion at this point, but it was seen as the head of the troublemakers. Her trade was to be destroyed unless she accepted that tea. It was a quite typical instance of that silly firmness which shatters empires. In order to enforce this measure, British troops were concentrated at Boston under General Gage. The colonists took countermeasures. The first colonial Congress met at Philadelphia in September, at which 12 colonies were represented up and down the East Coast there. True to the best English traditions, the Congress documented its attitude by a Declaration of Rights. Practically, this Congress was an insurrectionary government, but no blow was struck until the spring of 1775. Then came the first shedding of blood. I think we'll leave it here. We'll take a look at Lexington and Concord tomorrow, which starts the war, followed about a month and a half later with the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston. So we'll get there. We'll get to the Second Continental Congress, the formation of the Continental Army, and take things from there. All right. So again, this is part of the project, ApocatastasisInstitute's unified curricula. So this is the heart of our enrolled courses, especially our three-year undergraduate students, as well as providing ongoing education for our alumni and larger learning community, of which you here on BitChute, Rumble, YouTube are part of. So why don't you go to our website, the subsite for the project, and follow us along? We have a PDF of H.G. Wells here. We have a PDF of our poetry. And then head on over to Apocatastasis's Press and kindly purchase our books and help this college grow to its full stature. We have so many great texts, beautifully formatted in digital and physical copies. So much to see there, so much to read. So, all right, with all of that seen to, thank you for your attention, and I will catch you tomorrow. We're going to carry on indeed with the American Revolution, then we move to the French Revolution for the balance of the week. Thank you so much. Masalama.